The mountain air was a jagged blade, cutting through my lungs with every breath I took as I steered my heavy-duty truck up the winding access road. I'm Leo, an architect who spends his life designing structures meant to withstand the test of time. But as I looked out at the thick, suffocating blanket of white covering the peaks, I felt like a ghost haunting my own past. I bought this cabin nearly a decade ago, a sanctuary of cedar and stone tucked away from the relentless hum of the city. Back then, I was naive enough to believe I'd be here every other weekend, drinking coffee on the porch and watching the sunrise over the jagged ridge. But life, as it often does, had different plans. My firm grew, the projects became more demanding, and the 3-hour drive started to feel like a cross-country trek. Gradually, the cabin shifted from a weekend home to a seasonal retreat, a place I visited only when the world became too loud to bear. Despite my absence, I was a diligent owner. The taxes were paid, the utilities remained active, and the deed sat securely in my safe at home. It was mine, an undisputed piece of the earth that belonged to me. The cabin sits roughly 5 miles off the main dirt road, a distance that ensures total solitude. Out here, cell service is a fickle thing, fatting in and out like a weak heartbeat depending on how the mountain winds decide to blow that day. During the winter, the landscape transforms into a beautiful, treacherous prison. The snow cuts the property off from civilization entirely. Unless you have a truck with heavy-duty chains and a stubborn streak that borders on stupidity, you aren't getting in. Usually, I don't bother fighting the mountain. I wait for the thaw, throw my gear into the back of the truck, and disappear for a week of total silence. No clients, no deadlines, no demands. That was the routine. I'd show up, unlock the heavy oak door, air out the scent of pine and dust, and fix whatever the harsh winter had managed to knock loose. It was simple. It was predictable. However, this past winter was a beast. The storms rolled in one after another, stacking layer upon layer of ice and powder until the access road was nothing more than a memory. Every time I checked the weather, hopping for a window to drive up, another front would move in. I wasn't worried, though. No one lived close enough to bother the place, and most people with an ounce of common sense wouldn't dream of trekking that far into the wilderness without a damn good reason. But common sense is a rare commodity these days. It turns out that while I was waiting for the summer sun, someone else had already ventured into my woods. Someone had apparently hiked or snowmobiled up while the snow was still fresh. They saw a cabin with no tracks leading to the door, no smoke rising from the chimney, and no lights flickering in the windows. Instead of seeing a private home, they saw an opportunity. They convinced themselves that because I wasn't there to physically defend my borders, the property was abandoned. He was a man who fed on internet delusions, someone who believed in the twisted logic of unclaimed land and squatters' rights. To him, my hard-earned retreat was a relic of a corporate fiction that didn't apply to a free man like him. He didn't just break in, he moved in. He smashed the back window, bypassed the locks, and settled into my living room like a king taking a vacant throne. As I finally pushed my truck through the last of the slushy drifts today, I was expecting the usual chores, clearing the gutters and checking for roof leaks. I was looking forward to the quiet, but as I rounded the final bend and the cabin came into view, my blood turned to ice. A thin gray trail of smoke was drifting lazily from the chimney into the clear blue sky. Someone was in my house. Someone was sitting by my fireplace, burning my wood and breathing my air. I pulled the truck into the driveway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Parked right where I usually leave my vehicle was a rusted, beat-up Silverado. The doors didn't match the body, and a makeshift camper shell was held onto the bed with frayed bungee cords. My mind raced through possibilities, a hiker in trouble, an emergency. But the changed locks and the internal deadbolt I could see through the glass told a much darker story. This wasn't an accident. This was an invasion. I sat in the idling truck for what felt like an eternity, the vibration of the engine the only thing keeping me grounded. My eyes were locked on that thin ribbon of smoke. It mocked me. It was a signal of domesticity in a place where I was currently the outsider. My mind flashed through every horror movie trope. Was it a group of drifters, a meth lab, or just a hiker who had broken in to survive the cold? I wanted to believe it was the latter. I wanted to believe that a simple, "Thank you for saving my life," and a quick exit would resolve this. I reached into the glove box and pulled out my registration and the deed summary I kept for tax purposes. If this was a legal misunderstanding, I had the paperwork to prove this was my sanctuary. I stepped out of the truck, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. The sound felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the mountains. As I approached the porch, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't just wood smoke. It was the stench of rotting garbage and unwashed skin. My beautiful cedar deck was littered with empty tin cans and cigarette butts. But the most jarring sight was the door. The heavy brass handle I'd picked out myself had been ripped out, replaced by a cheap, industrial-looking deadbolt that had been crudely installed with wood screws. I pounded on the door. "Hello, this is Leo, the owner of this property. Who is in there?" Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. "I've called the authorities. You need to come out now." I hadn't called yet, but the lie felt like a necessary shield. Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from inside. The new deadbolt clicked, a harsh, metallic sound, and the door creaked open just a few inches. A man stood there, framed by the darkness of the hallway. He looked to be in his late 50s, with a wild, unkempt beard that was more gray than brown. His eyes were the most unsettling part. They weren't the eyes of a panicked criminal. They were the eyes of a man who believed he was completely in the right. This was Silas. "You're trespassing on private land, traveler," he said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any warmth. I blinked, momentarily stunned. "Trespassing? This is my cabin. I'm Leo. I have the deed right here. You've broken into my home." Silas stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. He was wearing a tattered camo jacket and heavy work boots. He didn't look like he was retreating. He looked like he was defending a fortress. He held up a hand, palm out, as if to stop my words from reaching him. "I don't recognize the name Leo as a corporate entity with jurisdiction over this geographical coordinate," he stated, his tone shifting into something that sounded like a rehearsed legal script. "This land was abandoned. Under the laws of the First Republic and the natural rights of man, I have established a homestead. I have filed my claim with the Continental Congress." My brain struggled to process the word salad he was tossing at me. "The Continental Congress? Silas, if that's your name, that hasn't existed in over 200 years. This is the state of Colorado. You are in a house that I paid for with money I earned. You need to pack your things and leave before the sheriff gets here." Silas let out a dry, hacking laugh. "The sheriff is an agent of a foreign corporation. He has no authority over a sovereign citizen of the soil. I am a living soul, not a strawman. Your deed is a contract with a fraudulent government. By occupying this space and improving it, I have severed your claim." I looked past him into the living room. My handcrafted coffee table was covered in strange, handwritten manifestos and maps. My leather sofa was stained with grease. The improvements he mentioned were nothing more than the desecration of my memories. "I'm not going to argue politics with you," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and mounting rage. "You have 10 minutes to get into that rusted-out truck and drive away, or this ends very badly for you." Silas leaned in, his face inches from mine. I could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You think you're the first agent they've sent? I've spent my life preparing for this. I am the law here. If you step 1 foot closer to that door, you are committing an act of war against a sovereign nation." He wasn't just a squatter. He was a fanatic. He had replaced reality with a delusion that turned me into the villain of his story. As he backed into the cabin, he didn't look away. He kept his eyes locked on mine until the door slammed shut and the bolt slid into place. I stood there on my own porch, a stranger to my own home, realizing that a simple conversation wasn't going to fix this. The air felt colder than it had 10 minutes ago, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly unsafe in the place I loved most. The slam of the door felt like a physical blow. I stood on the porch, staring at the scarred wood, my mind reeling. I had designed high-rise buildings and managed million-dollar contracts, but nothing in my professional life had prepared me for a man who looked at a legal deed and saw a corporate fiction. This wasn't just a squatter looking for a warm bed. Silas was a true believer in a dangerous, twisted ideology. I walked back to my truck, my boots crunching through the icy slush. My hands were shaking, not just from the biting mountain cold, but from a surge of adrenaline that made my vision sharpen. I reached for my phone, but as I feared, the signal bar was a hollow, empty triangle. I was isolated. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the ridge, and they likely hadn't been up here since the first snowfall either. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the cabin. Through the front window, I could see Silas moving. He wasn't packing. He was packing. He seemed to be talking to himself, or perhaps to a camera. Every few seconds, he would point a finger at the window, gesturing wildly toward me as if he were delivering a lecture to an invisible audience. I realized then that Silas likely had a support system of other sovereign citizens online. He probably thought he was a hero, a pioneer taking back land from the tyrannical overreach of people like me. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a representative of a system he hated. I decided to try one more time, but this time I stayed by my truck. I didn't want to be trapped on that narrow porch if things turned ugly. I rolled down my window and shouted, "Silas, listen to me. This isn't going to end the way you think it is. I have GPS logs, I have the purchase history, and I have a family that knows exactly where I am. You can't stay here." The cabin door creaked open again, but only halfway. Silas didn't step out this time. Instead, he poked his head out, his eyes wide and frantic. "GPS is a military tracking system used to enslave the populace," he screamed. "Your threats mean nothing to a man who has stepped outside the jurisdiction of your maritime law. You are currently in dry dock, traveler, and I am the admiral of this vessel." It was absurd. It was almost comical, but the intensity in his voice was terrifying. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of laminated cards. He began tossing them onto the snow-covered driveway. "Read them," he bellowed. "Read the fee schedule. Every minute you remain on this land, you owe me 1 ounce of fine silver. Every time you speak my name without my consent, it's a $5,000 lien against your soul." I looked down at the cards. They were filled with dense, tiny text, citing common law and Magna Carta and a bunch of nonsense about the strawman. It was clear he had spent years down this rabbit hole. He wasn't going to be talked out of this. He had built a fortress of delusions, and my presence was the first real-world test of his imaginary laws. "I'm going to the bottom of the hill to get a signal, Silas," I yelled back, trying to keep my voice steady. "When I come back, I won't be alone. The police will be here, and they don't care about your silver ounces or your maritime law. They have handcuffs and jail cells." The mention of the police changed his demeanor instantly. The frantic packing stopped. He became deathly still. A dark, cold shadow seemed to fall over his face. "The mercenaries of the crown," he whispered, though his voice carried in the silent mountain air. "You would bring armed invaders to a peaceful homestead." He disappeared back into the house. For a second, I thought I had finally gotten through to him, that the reality of jail had finally punctured his fantasy. I put the truck in reverse, ready to get the hell out of there and find a phone. But then the front window shattered. The sound of breaking glass was followed by the unmistakable heavy clack-clack of a pump-action shotgun. Silas wasn't running. He was arming himself. He pushed the barrel of a 12-gauge through the broken pane, resting it on the sill. "You've declared war, Leo," he screamed, using my name for the first time, though he spat it out like a curse. "And in a state of war, the sovereign has the right to defend his borders with lethal force." My heart stopped. I was sitting in a glass and metal box, and 20 feet away, a man with a shattered mind was leveling a weapon at my chest. I didn't think, I reacted. I floored the gas, the tires spinning wildly in the slush as I ducked below the dashboard. The world turned into a blur of gray slush and adrenaline. As I ducked beneath the dashboard, the cabin's front window seemed to explode. The roar of the shotgun blast was deafening, a physical force that rattled the frame of my truck. I felt the glass of my passenger side window shatter, spraying tiny, diamond-like shards across the seat. Silas wasn't just warning me anymore. He was trying to kill me. "Go, go, go!" I screamed at myself, my voice sounding distant and hollow over the ringing in my ears. I slammed the shifter into drive and floored it. The tires clawed at the icy gravel, fishtailing wildly. I didn't care about the paint job or the suspension. I just needed to put distance between my skull and that shotgun. As the truck lurched forward, I caught a glimpse of Silas in the side view mirror. He had stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun tucked firmly into his shoulder. He looked like a man possessed, his beard flying in the wind, his mouth open in a silent war cry. He pumped the action again, clack, clack, and a second shell flew into the snow. Boom! The second shot hit the tailgate of the truck with the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. The vehicle bucked, but I kept my foot pinned to the floor. I didn't look back again until I had rounded the first sharp bend in the trail, putting a thick wall of pine trees and granite between me and my own front door. I finally slowed down about half a mile away, my chest heaving so hard it pained me. My hands were locked onto the steering wheel with a grip so tight my knuckles were white. I looked down at my lap. I was covered in glass and a small sliver had sliced my cheek, but I was alive. The silence of the mountain had returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It felt heavy, pregnant with the threat of what was behind me. I reached for my phone again, still no service. The towering peaks that I used to find majestic now felt like cell signal shields, trapping me in a dead zone with a madman. I had a choice. I could keep driving all the way back to the main highway, a 40-minute trip in these conditions, or I could stop at the High Ridge Point, a rocky outcrop about a mile ahead where hikers usually caught a bar or two of service. I chose the ridge. I couldn't just leave him there to burn my house down or wait for some innocent hiker to wander into his sovereign territory. As I drove, my mind turned to the weapon tucked under my own seat. I'm a licensed gun owner. I grew up hunting and I carry for protection, especially when traveling into the backcountry alone. But the thought of a shootout with a man like Silas made my stomach churn. This wasn't a movie. This was my life, my cabin, and a man who had clearly lost his grip on reality. I reached High Ridge Point and slammed the truck into park. I grabbed my phone and held it up to the windshield, praying, 1 bar, then 2. I dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, professional, and felt like a lifeline to the real world. My name is Leo Miller, I started, my voice cracking. I'm at 442 Pine Crest Road. I just went to my seasonal cabin and found an armed squatter. He fired at me. He has a shotgun. He's claiming the land is his under some sovereign citizen nonsense. My truck is hit. I'm bleeding. Sir, stay calm, the operator replied. Are you in a safe location? I'm a mile away, but he has a vehicle. He might follow me. I am dispatching units from the county sheriff's office now. Because of the snow and the location, it may take 20 to 30 minutes. Do not return to the property. Do you have a description of the suspect? His name is Silas, I said, wiping blood from my cheek. Mid-50s, camo jacket, gray beard. He's heavily armed and completely delusional. Please, tell them to be careful. He doesn't think the law applies to him. As I hung up, I looked back toward the trail. Far in the distance, through the trees, I saw a flash of silver. My heart plummeted. It was the rusted Silverado. Silas wasn't content with just driving me away. He was coming to finish the eviction. I stared into the side view mirror, and for a second my heart stopped beating. The rusted Silverado emerged from the tree line like a predator stalking wounded prey. Silas wasn't staying back to defend his sovereign soil. He was coming for me. In his twisted mind, I was a witness, a corporate mercenary, or perhaps just a threat to the fantasy he had built within my walls. Whatever the reason, he was driving with a reckless abandon that suggested he had nothing left to lose. I slammed the truck into gear. The High Ridge Point was a small clearing, and there wasn't much room to maneuver. I had to get back to the main access road, but that meant navigating a series of treacherous, ice-slicked switchbacks. If I went too fast, I'd slide off the cliff. If I went too slow, Silas would be on my bumper with that 12-gauge. Come on, Leo, keep it together, I whispered, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. I floored it, the rear of my truck fishtailing as the tires fought for purchase on the slushy incline. Behind me, Silas was gaining ground. He knew these roads. He'd been living here for months, likely scouting every inch of the terrain while I was sitting in boardrooms in the city. He pushed his old Chevy to the limit, the engine roaring with a high-pitched mechanical scream that echoed off the granite walls of the canyon. As I approached the first sharp turn, I saw Silas lean out of his driver's side window. He wasn't steering with two hands anymore. He had the shotgun propped against the side mirror. Boom! The shot went wide, shattering against a pine tree to my left, sending a spray of needles and bark into the air. He was trying to take out my tires. He wanted me stuck here, immobilized in the dead zone. I swung the truck around the bend, the tires screaming. The gap between us closed to 20 feet. I could see his face now, red, contorted with a terrifying mix of rage and righteousness. He was shouting something, his mouth moving frantically, but the wind and the engines drowned out his delusions. Then came the straightaway. This was my only chance to pull away. My truck was newer, more powerful, but the weight of the snow was a great equalizer. I pushed the engine to 4,000 RPMs, the turbo whistling as I gained a few yards of breathing room. But Silas had a different plan. Instead of following the curve of the road, he took a dangerous shortcut, a steep, snow-covered embankment that bypassed the next switchback. His truck bounced violently, the camper shell rattling as if it were about to fly off, but he cleared the gap. He slammed back onto the main road just feet behind me, his front bumper catching the corner of my tailgate. The impact sent my truck into a spin. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of white snow, gray sky, and dark trees. I fought the wheels, steering into the skid, praying that the guardrail, or what was left of it, would hold. My truck slammed into a snowbank, the engine stalling with a sickening thud. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating. I looked at the rearview mirror. Silas had stopped his truck 10 yards back, blocking the road entirely. He stepped out, the shotgun held at his waist. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like an ancient, vengeful spirit of the mountain. "You brought this on yourself, Leo Miller," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the idling of his battered engine. "You tried to bring the statutes into the garden. Now you'll pay the fee in blood." My hand went to the holster under my seat. My heart was thundering against my ribs. I didn't want to kill this man, but I realized with a sudden, cold clarity that Silas was done talking. He began to walk toward my truck, one slow, deliberate step at a time. He was savoring the moment. He was the king of his mountain, and I was the intruder he was about to erase. I took a deep breath, gripped my pistol, and opened the door just as Silas raised the shotgun to his shoulder. The cabin door of my truck acted as a thin metal shield between me and a madman. As I rolled out and into the knee-deep snow, the cold hit me like a physical punch, but the heat of the adrenaline kept my senses sharp. I stayed low, using the engine block of my stalled truck for cover. 10 yards away, Silas stood in the middle of the road, his boots planted firmly in the slush. He looked like a man out of time, a pioneer from a dark, alternate history who believed he was purging an invader from his land. "Drop the weapon, Silas," I screamed, my voice raw. I didn't point my pistol yet. I kept it low, hopping against hope that the sight of another armed man would shatter his delusion. "The police are on their way. This doesn't have to end in a body bag." Silas let out a chilling, guttural laugh. "The police? You mean the mercenaries of the United States Corporation? They have no power here, Leo. I'm a living man on the land. You are just a shadow, a paper construct trying to claim my soil." He began to shoulder the shotgun. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if he were mocking me. He knew I didn't want to fire. He was counting on my morality being a weakness. "I'm warning you," I yelled, my heart hammering so hard I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. "I have a right to defend myself." "You have no rights," Silas bellowed. "You abandoned the temple. I am the priest of this mountain now." Just as his cheek pressed against the stock of the 12-gauge, the sound of a distant, high-pitched wail broke through the mountain air. It was a siren, then another. They were faint, echoing through the canyons, but they were unmistakable. The sheriff's deputies were coming up the main access road. For a split second, the fanatical mask on Silas's face flickered. He looked toward the sound, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. In that moment of distraction, I saw my chance to end this without a shot. "They're coming for you, Silas. Look at the ridge." A flash of blue and red light reflected off the granite peaks above us. The cavalry was near, but they were still minutes away, minutes that felt like hours in the freezing silence. Silas turned his gaze back to me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "If I'm going down, I'm taking the owner with me," he screamed. He leveled the shotgun directly at my head. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to pray. I squeezed the trigger of my pistol. The crack of my 9 echoed off the valley walls. I wasn't aiming to kill. I aimed for his shoulder, hoping to disable his lead arm. Silas spun as the bullet tore through his camo jacket. His shotgun discharged into the air, the blast sending a cloud of snow falling from the trees above like white ash. He fell to one knee, the shotgun slipping from his grasp into the deep powder. He didn't scream. He didn't cry out in pain. He just stared at the blood blooming through the fabric of his sleeve with a look of utter confusion, as if his sovereign status should have made him bulletproof. "It's over," I panted, my weapon still trained on him. "Stay down, Silas, don't move." He looked up at me, his eyes glazed. You violated the peace," he whispered, his voice losing its booming authority. "You'll be fined in the court of heaven." The sirens grew louder, and suddenly the ridge was flooded with light. 3 SUV patrol cars roared around the bend, their tires churning up a storm of slush. Deputies leaped out before the vehicles even came to a full stop, their tactical lights blinding me. "Police, drop the weapon, drop it now." I didn't hesitate. I set my pistol on the hood of my truck and stepped back, my hands high in the air. I was shaking violently now, the fight or flight response finally giving way to pure, cold shock. 2 deputies tackled Silas, who began to struggle and scream about jurisdiction and Article 4 as they pressed his face into the frozen ground. Another deputy ran toward me, his weapon drawn but lowered as he saw my compliance. "Are you Leo Miller?" he shouted over the noise of the idling engines and Silas's frantic chanting. "Yes," I managed to say, my teeth chattering. "I'm Leo. He tried to kill me." The deputy looked at my shattered truck, the bullet holes in the tailgate and the blood on my face. He nodded slowly, holstering his gun. "Sit tight, Mr. Miller, it's over. We've got him." But as I watched them drag a handcuffed, bleeding Silas toward a patrol car, I didn't feel like a winner. I looked back toward where my cabin sat, hidden in the dark woods. My sanctuary had been turned into a battlefield, and the silence I had traveled so far to find was now filled with the sound of static and handcuffs. With Silas finally restrained and screaming into the floorboards of a patrol car about illegal detention, the tension should have dissipated. But as the flashing blue and red lights cut through the falling snow, a new kind of dread settled over me. The deputies took my statement while a medic patched up the graze on my cheek, but my eyes remained fixed on the mountain path leading back to my cabin. "Mr. Miller," Deputy Vance said, his voice low and sympathetic, "we need to clear the structure. Since you're the owner and the scene is technically secure, you can accompany us to identify your property, but I have to warn you, these guys usually don't take good care of the places they liberate." I nodded, though my stomach twisted. We drove back up the trail in a convoy. When we reached the clearing, the cabin looked different under the harsh beams of the police spotlights. It no longer looked like a retreat, it looked like a ruin. As we stepped through the front door, now hanging off its hinges where Silas had forced his crude locks, the smell hit me first. It was an overpowering cocktail of wood smoke, rotting meat, and something metallic. My heart sank. The interior, which I had spent years meticulously designing with custom cedar finishes and hand-woven rugs, was unrecognizable. "Clear," the deputies shouted as they moved through the rooms with flashlights. I followed behind them, my boots clicking on the hardwood floor that was now covered in layers of filth. Silas hadn't just lived here. He had transformed the space into a headquarters for his madness. My expensive leather armchairs had been pushed into a corner to make room for a makeshift legal desk. A sheet of plywood balanced on milk crates, covered in stacks of sovereign paperwork, wax seals, and binders full of gibberish. The walls were the worst part. Silas had used a black marker to scrawl natural law and common law jurisdiction across the white-painted pine. He had even drawn a map of the surrounding forest, marking out borders and checkpoints, as if he were the general of a one-man army. "Look at this, Leo," Vance said, gesturing toward the kitchen. My high-end stove was encrusted with weeks of burnt food. But more disturbingly, Silas had dismantled the smoke detectors and disabled the security cameras I had installed years ago. He hadn't just bypassed them. He had smashed them, as if he believed the lenses were literal eyes of the corporation watching him. In the master bedroom, the sense of violation peaked. He had been sleeping in my bed, but he'd stripped the mattress and replaced it with a dirty sleeping bag. My clothes had been tossed into a heap in the closet, used as rags to clean his Silverado and his weapons. Under the bed, the deputies found a stash of ammunition and several notice of intent documents addressed to me. He had been planning to mail them to my office, not to negotiate, but to fine me for millions of dollars for the crime of owning my own home. "He was building a case," the deputy remarked, flipping through a binder. "In his mind, he was already the legal owner. He was just waiting for you to show up so he could serve you his version of justice." As I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of my sanctuary, the weight of the legal fallout began to dawn on me. This wasn't just a simple break-in. Silas was part of a movement that didn't recognize the court system. Dealing with him in the coming months wasn't going to be a matter of a quick trial. It was going to be a war of paper and ideology. The investigators told me that because Silas had established residency for several months, the eviction process, even with the criminal charges, would be a bureaucratic nightmare. Even though he had shot at me, his sovereign allies would likely flood the county court with frivolous lawsuits and liens against my name. I walked out onto the porch, breathing in the cold air to clear the scent of the cabin from my lungs. The sun was beginning to peek over the ridge, casting a pale, cold light on the snow. I had my cabin back, but as I looked at the shattered windows and the graffiti-covered walls, I realized that the peace I had bought this place for was gone. Silas was in handcuffs, but he had left a ghost in my home, a ghost of paranoia and violence that I wasn't sure I could ever scrub away. The months that followed the standoff at High Ridge were far from peaceful. While the physical wounds on my cheek healed within a week, the legal and psychological scars ran much deeper. Silas wasn't just a squatter. He was a symptom of a growing madness. And as I soon learned, the sovereign citizen movement doesn't go away just because their leader is in a jail cell. The court proceedings were a circus. Silas refused to recognize the judge's authority, standing in the dock and shouting that the American flag in the courtroom had gold fringe, which, according to his delusional logic, meant the court was operating under Admiralty law. He refused to sign any documents unless he could use a thumbprint in red ink, claiming he was a flesh-and-blood man and not a corporate entity. But the real headache began when his associates found out. My office in the city began receiving hundreds of pages of legal notices. They filed fraudulent liens against my primary home and my architecture firm, claiming I owed the sovereign estate of Silas $10 million in silver for violating his peace. It took my lawyers months and thousands of dollars to clear my credit and prove these filings were baseless. It was paper terrorism, designed to ruin my life without ever firing another bullet. Eventually, the weight of the evidence, the attempted murder, the break-in, and the dashcam footage from my truck was too much even for Silas's nonsensical defense. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. As they led him away, he didn't look at the judge. He looked at me, his eyes still burning with that same terrifying conviction. He whispered, "You haven't won, traveler. The land remembers." I returned to the cabin in late spring, after the snow had finally melted and the mountain was green again. I brought a team of professional cleaners and contractors. We stripped the scrawled manifestos from the walls, replaced the desecrated flooring, and installed a state-of-the-art security system with satellite uplinks. I replaced the broken windows with reinforced glass and added a heavy steel core to the front door. But as I sat on the porch on that first quiet evening, the silence felt different. Before Sela's, the silence was a comfort, a blanket that wrapped around me and shielded me from the world. Now the silence felt like a void. Every snap of a twig in the woods made me reach for my holster. Every distant engine sound made me wonder if another sovereign was coming to claim what they hadn't earned. I realized that Sela's had stolen more than just my wood and my space. He had stolen my sense of safety. I spent one night there, but I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face in the shadows of the hallway, hearing the clack-clack of that shotgun echoing in the wind. A month later, I put the cabin on the market. It was a hard decision, one that felt like a defeat, but I knew I couldn't find peace in a place that had seen so much hate. The couple who bought it were young, full of the same dreams I had 10 years ago. I didn't tell them about the Continental Congress or the Lions. I just told them to keep the gate locked. Now I spend my weekends in the city or traveling to places where there are people and lights. I've learned that owning land is a fragile thing. We like to think that a piece of paper and a fence make us safe, but the truth is, we are only as secure as the society around us. Out there in the deep woods where the law is thin, the only thing that truly belongs to you is what you are willing to defend. I still have a picture of the cabin on my desk. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if the natural law Sela's talked about was real in one sense, that in the wilderness, the strongest or the most desperate always try to take what belongs to the civilized. I'm just glad I was prepared enough to be the one who walked away. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people aren't the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who believe they are the heroes of their own twisted reality. What would you have done if you arrived at your own home to find an armed stranger claiming it was theirs? Would you have stayed to fight or driven away immediately? And do you think the legal system does enough to protect homeowners from squatters like Sela's? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you found this story intense, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want to hear more true stories of survival, revenge, and justice, subscribe and turn on all notifications. You don't want to miss our next video, where we dive into a case that's even more unbelievable than this one. Thanks for watching until the very end. Stay safe out there and remember, always watch your back. See you in the next one.